Welcome to The House Rules, the gaming compliance podcast from the Association of Certified Gaming Compliance Specialists. In this podcast, we will hear from casino and iGaming compliance specialists, discussing the latest trends and hot topics impacting the industry. We will also be focusing on careers in compliance, hearing from seasoned professionals about their own career paths and sharing their expertise and insights. In this episode, join Ashley Franssen-Tingley from the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking for an in-depth discussion on human trafficking. Ashley will introduce us to the subject, explore the distinct topics of sex trafficking and labour trafficking, and provide an assessment of the prevalence of human trafficking in the Canadian gaming industry. We will take a deep dive into how trafficking can intersect with the gaming and hospitality sector. And finally, we will be introduced to the tools and resources that those in the gaming sector can use to combat human trafficking.
Thank you to the Association of Certified Gaming Compliance Specialists for the opportunity to be part of this fantastic initiative. This training is meant as an introduction to human trafficking in Canada and will hopefully illuminate how this crime intersects with both the gaming and hospitality sectors. A very special thank you to the lived experience expert who assisted with the content development and review process to ensure that this training was person-centered, trauma-informed, and reflective of the realities of trafficking in Canada today. We are incredibly grateful to have been able to include their critical insights as part of this project. Before we begin, please note that this training does focus on a very difficult subject. However, it is meant to be educational in nature without being sensational. Please take care while listening and feel free to step away if you need a moment to process. If you are in need of support, the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-833-900-1010. Before we begin today, I want to acknowledge that while this is a virtual training, the land on which I am recording this session is the traditional home of many nations, including the Mississauga of the New Credit, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee people. I'm thankful to be able to work in partnership and live on the land, and really grateful to the many First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people who have cared for this territory since time immemorial, and who continue to contribute to the strengthening of all communities across Turtle Island. Land acknowledgements are a traditional way that First Peoples recognize the other nations which they were visiting. And today, acknowledging traditional Indigenous territories is one way to recognize both the historical and contemporary Indigenous presence and land rights. It is just one small step that we can take towards dismantling the ongoing impact of colonialism and oppression of Indigenous people in Canada and move closer towards reconciliation. I encourage you to do your own reading and learn about the traditional land on which you currently reside or work, which nations recorded or unrecorded have taken care of the land, and which treaties apply to the land on which you're situated, and critically reflect on your own relationship to the land. My name is Ashley. I'm the Director of Stakeholder Relations at the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking, and I will be leading you through this session. But before we jump into outcomes for the training, I want to start with a poignant quote from the former US President Barack Obama, who said of human trafficking, "It ought to concern every person because it is a debasement of our common humanity. It ought to concern every community because it tears at our social fabric. It ought to concern every business because it distorts markets. And it ought to concern every nation because it endangers public health and fuels violence and organized crime." This training will be broken down into 6 parts, and at the end, you'll be better able to define human trafficking and understand the differences between sex and labor trafficking and how they happen here in Canada. You'll also be better equipped to understand how trafficking activity intersects with the gaming and hospitality sector in Canada. You'll have some concrete red flag indicators to be mindful of, and finally, some tools and resources that you can take back to your workplace and also back to your community. And while you may be taking this for training, for work-related purposes, you're also a member of your community. And so it's important to remember that human trafficking is happening in all of our communities, and each one of us has the opportunity to be part of the solution. I really hope you're able to have some concrete takeaways, both personally and professionally. Very quickly, before we jump in, the Canadian Centre is a national charity focused on mobilizing collective action and system change to end all forms of human trafficking in Canada. And really, Centre was developed to enhance cross-sectoral collaboration with governments, the private sector, not-for-profits, as well as the Canadian public. And we really function as that backbone organization to do that supporting cross-sectoral collaboration by sharing information and best practices, by bringing people together to reduce duplicate efforts, and really to kind of dismantle the siloed approach to addressing trafficking in Canada. We are both publicly and privately funded, and also the operators of the 24/7 National Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, developed with support from the Federal Department of Public Safety and other generous donors. Some of our work includes primary research and data collection to shine a light on the issue of trafficking. We work to educate communities, networks, service providers about the reality of this issue and to share that hotline resource. And we also work with policymakers at all levels to address the systemic issues that are impacting trafficking, and advocating for service provision and funding to bring forward real change. So, what is human trafficking? Human trafficking is a criminal activity in which people are forced, coerced, or deceived into an exploitative situation for another person's gain. So, in Canada, anyone involved in the receiving, the harboring, the transporting, the obtaining of a person for the purpose of exploitation has committed a trafficking offense. Human trafficking is often described as a crime that is hidden in plain sight because victims and traffickers don't always outwardly appear in the ways in which television or pop culture tell us that they do. The unfortunate reality is, in fact, that pop culture depictions of human trafficking often do more harm than good and may misrepresent how this is really occurring in our communities. A little later on, I will take you through some of the common misperceptions about human trafficking. But really, in Canada, we see two main forms of human trafficking, which are sex and labor trafficking. Some of our early data around the hotline reported cases identifies that 71% of all reported cases to the hotline were identified as sex trafficking, followed by labor trafficking at 7%. And approximately 20% of cases were identified as not specified, and that's really when someone calls the hotline without specifying the nature of their trafficking situation. But what's the important takeaway here is we really believe that labor trafficking is quite underrepresented in our current data set, and is certainly vastly underreported in the data set collected by Statistics Canada at the federal level. And we know that migrant workers in particular are a difficult population to reach due to the fact that they are often in secluded rural areas, may not have ready access to the internet, as well as language and cultural barriers. Human trafficking is identified in two places in Canada. First, it is a criminal code offense in the Canadian Criminal Code, as well as identified in the Immigration, Refugee and Protection Act. The criminal code understanding of the crime of human trafficking has three main elements. So on the right, you'll see the act, which is what is done by the trafficker. And so any one of the listed activities in the red box are criminal acts as it relates to trafficking. And then in the middle there, you'll see the means. So this is the part of the trafficking activity that identifies how a person was trafficked and exploited. Did the trafficker use physical force or violence, coercion, threats, lies to lure someone into that trafficking situation? And then what are the actions that they took to keep that person stuck, keep them in the trafficking situation? And then the final element speaks to the reason or the purpose for the exploitation, which is most often for financial gain in forced commercial sexual activity or forced labor and services. What's important here, the takeaway is that you only one element from the act means purpose model here is required to substantiate a human trafficking claim. However, in reality, things are far more complex and unfortunately not so black and white. Unfortunately, we often see the terms trafficking and smuggling used interchangeably, but they are in fact two very distinct things. So again, before we kind of jump into the meat about what human trafficking is, we need to talk about what trafficking is not. And so while you can see on the left side, trafficking is a crime against a person, where smuggling is really a crime against a nation's border. Trafficking is based on exploitation, smuggling is based on transportation. And trafficking does not require movement or a border to be crossed, whereas smuggling really requires that border crossing element. But the takeaway here really is that individuals who are smuggled into a country then become more at risk for trafficking because they often don't have status within that country, and that's a risk factor there. So, according to estimates from the International Labour Organization in Geneva, in 2021, there were an estimated 50 million people, including men, women, and children, who were victims of trafficking. Of these 50 million, 28 million were in forced labor and 22 million were trapped in forced marriages. Trafficking in human beings is not like any other crime. It really feeds off economic and gender inequalities and weak institutional policies. Unfortunately, the estimates are trending in the wrong direction, and we know that COVID-19 has only exacerbated the issue as the social fabric, our sense of connectedness, and the supporting institutions have frayed over the last 3 years. In the updated 2021 estimates, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe noticed an increase in reporting of other forms of exploitation, specifically trafficking for forced criminality, which went from about 2% to 24% globally within 5 years. And the European Union also reported that it is seeing an increase in cases in the cannabis industry, forced begging, and increases of reporting of forced marriages or sham marriages globally too. And in 2021, 31% of reporting countries surveyed identified an increase of cases of trafficking of persons with disability. And so, the global context for this conversation is important because many people mistakenly think that human trafficking only takes place overseas or that it only impacts non citizens. And in the next slide, we're going to talk about the myths and misperceptions about human trafficking and why that is not correct. So on this slide, I'm going to take you through some commonly held misperceptions about trafficking in Canada. And it's important to debunk these really early on in today's training so that your foundation of knowledge is grounded in the reality of the Canadian context. So on the top there, you'll see myth number one is that human trafficking only involves foreign nationals being brought into Canada. And while foreign nationals, often migrant workers, are trafficked into and can also be trafficked once they arrive here to work in Canada, it's important to note that Canadian citizens and permanent residents are also targeted for trafficking. Many people mistakenly think that human trafficking is only a big city problem, but we know that police reported cases of trafficking in Canada tend to be concentrated in urban centers. But we know that human trafficking happens in Canadian communities, both big and small, urban and rural, where there is an investment in dedicated education, awareness, and resources for all stakeholders. Usually means high rates of identification also follow. Myth number three is that sex trafficking starts with kidnapping or that traffickers target people they don't know. And while this can happen, most of the time traffickers know their victim and may have a romantic relationship with them, maybe a family member, maybe a friend, or may have an employer-employee relationship with the victim. Number four, only women and girls are targeted for sex trafficking. Again, this is not true. Men and boys can be victims of trafficking, and we know that gender diverse and transgender people are being exploited and trafficked at incredibly high rates compared to their overall population size. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but trafficking does not require movement. Traffickers do utilize movement to keep victims controlled and disoriented, but many survivors report being trafficked within their own communities or within their own homes. Number six, trafficked persons are held against their will and unable to leave their situation. And again, while this can happen, and we know that oftentimes victims of trafficking on the outside may appear to have the appearance of freedom of movement and control over their person and their belongings, but in fact they are being psychologically controlled and manipulated with lies and threats. And so those bonds are actually more psychological in nature, not physical. And finally, myth number seven, that all commercial sex is human trafficking. Again, this is not true. People choose to engage in sex work for a variety of reasons, whereas trafficking involves coercion, manipulation, control, violence, and a lack of choice. So let's talk about the risk factors that make a person more likely to be targeted by a trafficker. As you can see on this slide, there are a number of individual and societal factors that make a person more at risk of being targeted. For example, Black, Indigenous people of color are targeted at higher rates than other groups. Foreign nationals, especially those without status, are targeted for trafficking. Young people experiencing marginalization of some kind, such as poverty, homelessness, mental health struggles, addictions, or involvement in the child welfare or justice systems, are also at risk. Other at-risk individuals include individuals who are newcomers, so maybe they don't speak English, young people searching for belonging or validation online, and then folks from equity-seeking groups who have already experienced pervasive systemic discrimination. Again, maybe easier for traffickers to disempower and control than other groups. It's important to note that traffickers rarely target people who are empowered, who have a supportive community, and who have all of their basic needs met. If you have a safe home, a supportive community, and healthy options, you likely won't be an easy target for trafficking. Instead, traffickers look for people who, due to their life circumstance, socioeconomic location, or other systemic factors, are just easier targets. Across all of the cases reported to the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline in its first year, we found that a staggering 90% of victims and survivors identified as female. The center's data also found that it's not just women and girls who are disproportionately targeted by trafficking. The data shows us that transgender men, women, and gender diverse individuals are victimized at much higher rates relative to their population size. While this group comprises approximately 0.24% of our total population, they represented 2% of all cases that were documented to the hotline in year one. So we know that this means that the victimization rate amongst this group is nearly 8 times higher than what you might expect if you were just looking at their share of the population. Traffickers are also incredibly opportunistic, and they will use a variety of recruitment methods and locations to target potential victims. Recruitment can come in the form of fake job ads. Often we're seeing it happen via social media. We know that there's peer-to-peer recruitment happening in schools, in shelters, other institutions. Again, we also know that female to female recruitment is especially challenging and complex to tease apart, as most often in these specific scenarios, a young person who was once a trafficking victim becomes a recruiter on behalf of the trafficker as a means of survival. Human trafficking does not impact everyone equally. However, we know intuitively that traffickers target those who've historically been marginalized. Evidence has found that victims are disproportionately more likely to come from Indigenous, Black, 2S LGBTQIA+, and migrant communities, and yet this reality still isn't well understood in Canada. In addition to experiencing higher rates of personal trauma, these groups face broader systemic issues that have helped foster distrust of our institutions. And within this context, they may hesitate to seek help from these institutions for fear of being re-victimized. And unfortunately, it's this reluctance to identify which has led to fewer officially reported trafficking cases and has created a situation where these marginalized or equity-seeking groups are invisible in our current data sets that are really used to guide policymaking and resource allocation. And so really the reality is that eliminating human trafficking then becomes very difficult if decision makers aren't able to see the full picture. As a national backbone organization, we are looking at the ways that we can partner across sectors to strengthen the safety net for victims and survivors of trafficking. And so some of the items that are required to improve Canada's response to trafficking are trauma-informed tailored services that are funded in perpetuity for survivors, cross-jurisdictional responses and strategies in every province and territory, improved communication amongst various stakeholders, governments, their entities, and agencies. And really, we need to look holistically at the underlying social factors that are contributing to trafficking. for both victims and perpetrators. And we really need to shift our focus on prevention efforts. Finally, increased training for judges, crown prosecutors, and law enforcement will allow survivors to have better outcomes. How is the center responding to these challenges and opportunities? So we are working with various governments to inform legislation and policy development. We work closely with survivor leaders and lived experience experts to do primary research to help fill those knowledge gaps. We're doing targeted outreach and awareness and education campaigns on sex and labor trafficking to the general public, but also to targeted groups. We do education awareness sessions such as this one across sectors to shine light on the issue of trafficking. And we work closely with our partner hotlines in the US and Mexico to share information and best practices. This next section will focus on sex trafficking in Canada. A form of sexual exploitation, sex trafficking refers to the forced, coercive, fraudulent, or deceptive exchange of sex for something of value. For example, money, food, drugs, alcohol, transportation, or shelter. This can include sexual exploitation online, including social media platforms, through sexual imagery or video. Now, you might be more familiar with the concept of pimping, and simply put, sex trafficking is another term for pimping. Typologies of sex trafficking can include escorting, illicit massage, forced pornography, forced camming, as well as forced stripping. Children and youth under the age of 18 cannot engage in sex work or cannot exchange sex for money, drugs, alcohol, transportation, etc., or any other object of necessity. Traffickers are extremely skilled at presenting themselves as potential protectors, as potential partners, or potential providers, which may sometimes feel like the perfect solution to what's going on in someone's life. So let's talk about how sex trafficking is typically happening in Canada. For the purpose of this slide, we're going to consider the potential targeted individual or victim to be female and the trafficker we will refer to as male. The most common scenario we see is the boyfriend trafficker, also known as the Romeo pimp. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a formula that accompanies this type of trafficking, and it is incredibly effective and easily replicated. On this slide, you will see the typical stages of grooming and exploitation. On the far left side is the luring stage, where traffickers are really looking to identify young people who have more obvious signs of being at risk. First contact is likely to be on social media, and then from there, the relationship is built. In the grooming and gaming stage, traffickers might be love bombing someone with the intention of compiling information about them. This will look like asking them lots of questions, paying special attention to them, maybe special gifts, or taking them out on dates. And really, in this stage, the traffickers are trying to find out what's missing in that person's life and trying to fill that need. For example, is this a runaway youth who needs shelter or maybe a place to belong? And by providing that or fulfilling that need, the trafficker is trying to ensure that the victim is dependent on them. As the relationship develops, the trafficker may slowly start to alienate the victim away from their community of supports, family, and trusted persons. During the manipulation and coercion stage, the trafficker may use the tactics of force, threats, violence, and deception. Here, the trafficker may also start to be hot and cold, which really is intentional to keep the victim on edge and keep them more willing to do whatever they can to keep the relationship in that honeymoon phase. Then at some point, the trafficker will ask the victim to do sexual things, either with them or with others or both. And maybe they'll be asked to do sexual things to repay the money that's been spent on them. Perhaps it's even propositioned as a way for the couple to maintain their new lifestyle or earn money together for their future. The trafficker might also tell the victim that something bad will happen to them if they don't do what the trafficker wants. Once the victim has engaged in that first sex act, these steps are now complete, and the trafficker can continue to use threats and violence to keep that person compliant. As I mentioned earlier when we discussed risk factors, simply belonging to certain cultural groups can make someone more at risk for being targeted by traffickers. And this is especially true for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit persons. Canada has a long history of exploiting Indigenous women and girls dating back to early European colonization. This history and its ongoing legacy is still well hidden in Canada. Pre-contact with European settlers, Indigenous communities were regarded as gender fluid and non-binary, and European concepts of gendered norms and power dynamics simply didn't exist. Historically, slavery was one of the ways that the value and use of Indigenous peoples was predetermined by white male settlers. The Native Women's Association of Canada states that historically, Indigenous women have been positioned as inherently less valuable and more available than non Indigenous, non racialized bodies. The violence experienced by women who are exploited, who are trafficked, or who identify as sex workers is not separate from colonial violence, but truly a central part of colonial violence. And again, as a result of ongoing colonialism and discrimination, Indigenous women and girls have less access to social supports and services, which puts them at a greater risk for being trafficked. Indigenous women and girls experience strong racial and institutional racism prior to being trafficked, and victims often come from places of oppression, systemic discrimination, and poverty. There is no denying the intersection between the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit persons and human trafficking. Some of the reoccurring themes that expose Indigenous women and girls to traffickers and facilitates their recruitment into trafficking include precarious housing and substandard living conditions, higher rates of unemployment, lack of access to social and economic resources, prior exposure to human trafficking, family violence and the impacts of colonization, residential school experiences and intergenerational trauma, as well as an involvement in the child welfare systems as well as the criminal justice system. Increasingly, anti-trafficking advocates and allies are actively working to challenge the existing frameworks and dominant colonial narratives that seek to erase Indigenous peoples, that mislabel them as minorities and portray the exploitation of Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people through a lens of criminalization. Now we're going to talk about some general indicators of sex trafficking, and it's really important to note that every survivor is unique and each situation of trafficking is unique. So a one size fits all approach to understanding these indicators is not helpful. Instead, we recommend that you consider a number of these indicators, but also keep in mind the general context of the situation and patterns of behavior in mind as well. Human trafficking is complex. These signs and indicators are often overlapping and nuanced. And again, indicators alone are not enough to identify trafficking. We really want to be mindful that indicators alone can increase policing and surveillance of other at-risk groups such as migrant sex workers. So unexplained withdrawal or absence from friends, family, and activities, sudden changes in appearance, including clothing, accessories, makeup, nails, providing scripted or rehearsed answers to casual questions, secretive behavior about a new friend group or partner, expressing fear and intimidation through facial expressions or body language, branding with tattoos of the trafficker's name or symbol, frequent absences from home, school, or work, visible signs of abuse, so cuts, burns, bruises, fatigue, substance use as well, not having passport, other forms of ID, potentially they're being controlled, someone else might be speaking on their behalf. So while under the control and direction of a trafficker, a victim may be told when they can eat, when they can sleep, who they can talk to, what clients to see, how many, and what sexual acts to perform. The trafficker may use necessities like substances, blackmail, lies, and violence to keep the victim compliant. The trafficker may force a victim to commit crimes such as theft, drug trafficking, recruitment of other young victims as a means of control. And we know that traffickers may take out loans and credit instruments in the victim's name, again, using financial abuse as a means of control. Finally, we know that human trafficking in Canada is happening at alarming rates, but unfortunately, it still remains a crime that is often hidden in plain sight. And there are a number of overlapping factors at play here. For example, a victim may have a trauma bond with their trafficker. Like we talked about, they may be in an intimate or familial relationship with that person and feel a sense of duty, loyalty, and love. Traffickers are often lying and manipulating victims into believing that they're going to get in trouble if they seek help, or that no one will love them if they come forward. So there's a lot of stigma that's associated with sex trafficking. Victims are often coached by traffickers to lie and give rehearsed answers to concerned family members, support workers, and police so as not to raise suspicion. Again, it's really important when we think about that trauma bond. The trafficker might be the only person who has ever shown them genuine attention, love, or support. And that's a really tough bond to break. The exploitation and trafficking can be really nuanced. And we know that many victims don't even understand that what's happening to them is a crime, and they certainly don't have the language to label what's happening to them. Traffickers are frequently moving victims from place to place. Oftentimes, they don't know how or where to get help. Finally, we talked about the distrust of institutions such as police and social service providers, as well as child protection agencies, especially for communities of color, make people reluctant to self report and self identify as being trafficked. Part 3, Labor Trafficking in Canada. In this section, we will talk about labor trafficking in Canada and identify some red flag indicators. Labor trafficking includes situations of debt bondage, forced labor, and involuntary child labor. In Canada, common types of labor trafficking include situations where people are forced to work in homes as domestic workers, farm workers who are coerced through violence as they plant and harvest crops, or factory workers held in inhumane conditions with little to no pay. Labor trafficking is also known as forced labor, and it's really the control and exploitation of a person for their labor or service, usually through force, threats, or deception. Situations of labor exploitation often include very poor and unsafe working conditions, abuse, extremely long hours, and unfair or non existent wages. Annually, Canada brings in nearly 1 million temporary foreign workers to fill the ever growing gaps in our labor market. Recent focus groups with migrant workers conducted by the Centre and key service delivery partners found that 60% of the migrant workers surveyed were not aware of their labor rights in Ontario. This is just one of the systemic reasons why migrant workers are often targeted for this abuse. Bonded labor or debt bondage is widely used as a method to exploit people. Victims become bonded laborers when their labor becomes the means of repaying a loan or a service. Really, the value of their work is often greater than the original sum of money that was borrowed. However, they continue to accrue interest on that loan, or they continue to incur additional costs with no means to repay the original sum. Forced labor, like I mentioned, is a situation where victims are forced against their will under the threat of violence or some other punishment. Their freedom is restricted, and there is a degree of ownership or control that is exerted by the employer. So let's briefly talk about how labor trafficking happens in Canada. Victims can be exploited for labor trafficking after they arrive here in Canada, but often the foundation of the exploitation begins in a person's home country, where they are recruited under false pretenses or incur large debts for the opportunity to come to Canada to work. Upon arrival, they may be met by a facilitator or a manager who takes them to the job site. Unfortunately, what was promised in terms of wages, work responsibilities, workplace protections, workplace accommodations are vastly different. Those who are labor trafficked may be fearful of immigration or police and may feel like the family they have back home are being threatened. And so they often endure the abuse for these reasons. So now I'm going to take you through some of the indicators of labor trafficking, and similar to the indicators on sex trafficking, it's not a one size fits all around labor trafficking situations. And really the signs and indicators are nuanced and overlapping. And so again, a combination of these indicators should be taken into consideration, as well as the general context of the situation. Some indicators of labor trafficking are individuals who are lacking the appropriate safety equipment or clothing to do their job. They are unable to come and go freely from their workplace or living quarters. They may be forced to work overtime without compensation. They don't have access to their ID or other forms, passport perhaps. It might be withheld or withheld by the employer. They may express fear or intimidation through facial expressions or body language. They may have someone else speaking on their behalf or providing direction or control. They may have visible signs of cuts and bruises and fatigue because, again, they're lacking those workplace protections. They may be underpaid or not paid at all for their work. And they may be having large portions of their pay that are going to unjustified or illegal fees. So there are a number of reasons that are intersecting on why someone who is being exploited for forced labor may choose not to report or to get help from a social service agency. Many migrant workers come to Canada and they may lack status. And so, this lack of status and fear of being deported potentially back to an unsafe situation in their home country may keep them quiet. They may also have an employer specific work permit and feel like they have few options or they don't know what their options or rights are. They may also be isolated and face cultural and language barriers to accessing assistance. They may have a distrust of public institutions, and they may have received threats from the employer to themselves, to their colleagues, and to their loved ones back home. Part 4. In this section, we will talk a little bit about the prevalence of human trafficking in Canada, why it's so challenging to get good sightlines on this issue, and walk you through some novel research from the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking that has an interesting nexus for the gaming and casino industry. Historically, our national understanding of human trafficking has typically been based on data collected via the Uniform Crime Reporting Survey, which is collected from police services across Canada. Relying on this one type of data to quantify the scope of trafficking is incredibly problematic. As I mentioned in part 1 of the training, reluctance of equity-seeking groups to interact with formal institutions has led to fewer officially reported trafficking cases. The StatsCan data largely represents cases of police-identified or reported cases of sex trafficking. However, labor trafficking is significantly underrepresented. And we know that as with other crimes like sexual assault, there is a low self-report rate among survivors who are choosing not to engage with the formal criminal justice process. While this data is imperfect, it does share some important findings. Number one, that most victims are trafficked by someone they know. 1/3 of victims report being trafficked by a current or former intimate partner. That men between the ages of 18 and 34 make up 2/3 of people accused of this offense, although female traffickers represented a lower proportion at 17%. The vast majority, so 89% of human trafficking charges in Canada were stayed, withdrawn, dismissed, or discharged. Currently, Canada has a completion rate of just 12% for human trafficking related charges. Survivors are typically not being served well by the criminal justice system. The Centre published its first report utilizing anonymized data from the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline. This first of its kind data set in Canada provided us with some larger trends and takeaways that confirmed what has been understood anecdotally in the Canadian anti-trafficking movement for a long time. In the first year of hotline operations, we noted 415 unique cases of trafficking that represented 593 victims and survivors. 1 in 3 callers to the hotline identified as a victim or survivor of trafficking. 14% of victims identified themselves as foreign nationals, which means about 86% were Canadian citizens or permanent residents. 90% of victims and survivors identified as female. Transgender and gender diverse individuals represent 2% of all calls from victims and survivors to the hotline, despite comprising just 0.24% of the total Canadian population. We recognize that transgender and gender diverse people are experiencing trafficking at higher rates compared to their overall population size. 44% of victims and survivors access the hotline during their trafficking experience, and 26% of all calls came from family and friends of a potential trafficking victim. The next few slides will touch on some of the larger trends that the report also identified. Trend 1 found evidence to support the notion that sex and labor trafficking are the most common forms of human trafficking in Canada. Trend 2, that human trafficking is a gender-based crime and must be treated as such. Again, that 90% of victims identified as cisgender females. And again, you can see that overrepresentation of transgender and gender diverse individuals. Human trafficking victims and survivors were the largest caller type, about 1 in 3, followed by social service providers and then family members. We also recognize that accessing the disparate, underfunded social support network is incredibly challenging for trafficking survivors. The center's data shows that 69% of all requests for services were for emergency shelter and housing, followed by 22% of referrals that came in for supportive counseling, and then 19% for case management. Family and friends. Trend number 5, family and friends are uniquely positioned to identify the early stages of grooming and luring and assist survivors. We know that much more education and awareness is needed for communities and families. Finally, COVID had a significantly negative impact on an already difficult to navigate social service sector. 3 years on, we recognize that many of the programs and partners have not necessarily rebounded to levels that they were at pre-pandemic. The Human Trafficking Corridors Report in Canada, published by the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking in 2021, was the first ever study of these human trafficking specific transportation corridors or routes in Canada. Again, this is something that the anti trafficking sector had long been discussing anecdotally. The report notes that traffickers benefit from transportation routes across the country for 3 main reasons. First, it allows them to move between commercial sex markets to obtain as much profit as possible. Movement allows them to lower risks associated with the trafficking activity since movement across municipal, provincial jurisdictions makes it harder for law enforcement to detect, investigate, and pursue human trafficking cases. It also allows them to maximize and maintain control over the individuals they are exploiting by reinforcing their social and physical isolation and keeping the victims confused and dependent on the trafficker. The report quotes a law enforcement respondent who stated, "The shorter amount of time spent in each city, the more beneficial it is for the traffickers. It takes time for police to set up an investigation. If they are only in town for a couple days, it's harder to track. Traffickers know this, and they are using this to their advantage." In the next section, we're going to do a bit of a deep dive on this report and again talk about how it intersects with the gaming industry. The corridors identified in this report do not exist for the sole purpose of human trafficking. These are primary transportation routes across Canada that are being used for other purposes, including transporting people and goods to various markets. And along these corridors, traffickers are often using smaller circuits, which are really just regular tours around an assigned district or territory. Cars are by far the most frequent used method of travel on these corridors, especially along the circuits, the human trafficking circuits. The overhead costs associated with driving are lower than for air travel, and traffickers can be nimble and adjust travel routes according to the demand for commercial sexual services. We also know that cars and rentals can be hired in the name of the victim, allowing the trafficker to remain one step removed from the trafficking operations. The corridors report also identified a number of key interprovincial corridors that are accessed by land and by air. The Trans-Canada Highway in particular functions as a corridor that connects commercial sex markets within all provinces and across the country. The red markers you see here, which contain the red dye, indicate locations of casinos that are on or very close by to this particular human trafficking corridor. Our research indicates that interprovincial corridors occur when traffickers transport victims across provinces to access those markets. They are largely organized around accessing the most competitive and highest paying markets. And because those additional costs associated with flying and driving long distance, interprovincial corridors tend to run between large urban centers with large markets. Once a trafficker and a victim arrive in a new province, they may stay to capitalize on the major urban commercial sex market in the city of arrival, or they may access other intra-provincial corridors within the province. Women and girls of Canadian nationality made up the vast majority of sex trafficking victims and survivors that were identified by both frontline service agencies and law enforcement respondents for this study. Only a small proportion of law enforcement, at 10%, and service provider respondents at 16% reported having worked previously with male or trans identified survivors. Of note, 53% of service providers and 40% of law enforcement respondents indicated that they had worked with survivors identifying as Indigenous. Indigenous women and girls are more likely to experience trafficking after traveling to urban centers from rural communities for reasons unrelated to exploitation, such as medical appointments, to access education, or to seek employment opportunities. Once in an unfamiliar urban area, Indigenous women and girls may be targeted by traffickers, or they may engage in high risk survival sex to meet their basic needs, such as access to food and shelter, which again makes them more at risk for being targeted for trafficking. Ontario's 401 highway connects Montreal, Quebec, and Windsor, Ontario, and between these two endpoints, there are several populous urban centers. Traffickers may choose to operate along the entire 401 corridor or capitalize on movement through this densely populated region, such as the Greater Toronto Area. You can see with the smaller red dots a number of populous destination cities along the 401 corridor and a number of casinos that are next to or within close proximity to this corridor. When interviewees were asked about the sectors or types of trafficking engaged with specifically along the trafficking corridors, over half of service providers and 90% of law enforcement officers interviewed for this report reported the widespread use of escort services to facilitate trafficking. Although other typologies of trafficking emerged from the interviews, they were not identified as using these trafficking corridors. This is likely because other forms of trafficking, such as illicit massage, pornography, and personal sexual servitude, likely rely on the trafficker having a stable location for that kind of exploitation to occur. Within Atlantic Canada, the stretch of the Trans-Canada Highway between Halifax and Moncton was the most frequently mentioned corridor by interviewees and is the most well-known human trafficking corridor in that part of the country. Traffickers go to Moncton not only to connect to online commercial sex market, but also to access the commercial markets in strip clubs. Um, while strip clubs are permitted to operate in New Brunswick, they are not legally permitted in Nova Scotia. As you can see, Halifax, Truro, and Moncton represent destination markets for commercial sexual activity, and both Moncton and Halifax each have a casino there. The Quebec to Alberta corridor was one of the most commonly identified by interviewees, with a noticeable trend of trafficking of young women from Quebec into central and western Canada, most notably Alberta. Law enforcement respondents specifically noted the trafficking of victims from Montreal to Calgary by airplane. So you see those black lines there, those are the air routes. Victims either traveled with their trafficker or may travel alone, or maybe they're met by the trafficker or an associate upon arrival in Alberta. Traffickers and victims may stay in Calgary to arrange commercial sex interactions in hotels near the airport or downtown, or traffickers may move victims along the interprovincial corridor between Calgary and Fort McMurray, which we will see in a later slide. This is a visual representation of the types of recruitment that were identified by research respondents. Trafficker types can be understood according to the methods they use to traffic people and the business models under which they operate. Service providers are noted in red, whereas law enforcement respondents are noted in black. You will see that both groups were similar in identifying boyfriend traffickers and organized gangs as the two most significant trafficking types. Respondents also noticed a strong interplay between gang-related traffickers and boyfriend-style traffickers, but found it really difficult to determine whether gang members use Romeo trafficking techniques to maintain strong psychological holds on the victims, to traffic them as part of the gang's criminal activities, or if boyfriend traffickers are also gang affiliated but not necessarily trafficking on behalf of their gang. The vast majority of respondents described traffickers as male, so 84% of service providers and 90% of law enforcement reported as such. And of note, 40% of law enforcement respondents and 39% of service provider respondents said that they had worked with victims and survivors who had been trafficked by other women. Within Alberta, human trafficking corridors connect the province's largest online commercial sex markets, while also accessing markets affiliated with extraction work camps in Fort McMurray and Grand Prairie. This corridor is used by both traffickers local to Alberta and those from outside the province. Mentioned earlier was the noticeable uptick from Ontario and Quebec. A growing trend for this particular corridor is the number of victims and survivors coming from central to eastern Canada. Um, Women being trafficked into Alberta with little to no English not only have language barriers that serve as another method of control, but this is believed that sex buyers may see women from Quebec as exotic and novel. Part 5. How human trafficking intersects with the gaming and hospitality industry. So this is the section of the training that will be specific to your work in the gaming and hospitality industry. First, we're going to cover red flag indicators and behaviors that are specific to human trafficking activity in the industry, and then highlight some things that resort staff might want to be mindful of. Casinos and hotels are also a destination for and can be a source of human trafficking activity. Sex trafficking survivors have reported that casinos were used as a meeting place for buyers, some of who were solicited online, and as a venue to solicit prospective new buyers. Traffickers are intent on maximizing profits, so hotel/casino properties can be appealing to them because potential customers may already have a room booked and they don't have to assume that additional expense. On the other hand, traffickers want to evade getting caught and avoid bringing their illicit activities to businesses that have a reputation of having staff trained on how to recognize human trafficking and who are willing to report it to management and alert senior level management and report to law enforcement. Exploitation can be happening in the resort or hotel, and traffickers may be using the casino as a way to wash and launder the proceeds of their crime. Or simply, they may be using the facilities as a way to occupy their time while the victim is in the hotel room with clients. The takeaway here is that casinos can also be a place of refuge for victims and survivors and offer them a secure location where they can feel comfortable to seek help or to try and escape their situation. Having staff trained on how to spot the signs of trafficking and publicly posting the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline number can offer someone the opportunity to leave a bad situation. And it's the intersection of those two that uniquely positions casinos and hospitality sector as another crucial ally in the fight against human trafficking. It's up to all of us to make our communities and workplaces inhospitable to traffickers. And we know we do this by getting trained, by knowing the signs of trafficking, by posting the hotline number and having clear reporting policies for staff. Another less discussed aspect of trafficking is the financial fraud and coerced debt that survivors often experience. Traffickers may force a victim to take out loans or put trafficking related charges in the victim's name. So things like hotels, rental cars, plane tickets, etc. And this is to really help keep the paper trail of the trafficking activity at an arm's length. This really means that trafficking often robs survivors of a healthy financial standing or footprint, making it incredibly challenging for them to do simple things like rent an apartment, receive a student loan to go back to school, or even secure gainful employment. We know that there are not enough supports for survivors across the country post exploitation, and certainly not enough supports for survivors navigating the financial impact of their trafficking experience. It should come as no surprise that to individuals in the gaming and compliance industry that the sector is vulnerable to money laundering. Customer accounts at casinos can be used as conduits to transfer significant amounts of funds through financial transaction channels. Typically, after minimal or no gaming activity, a deposit of funds with a casino is then cashed out by a customer or transferred to a bank account. Human trafficking is largely a cash based business, and organized traffickers need a way to legitimize and wash the proceeds of crime. A 2021 report from FinTrack found that both traffickers and victims conducted transactions at casinos. The report identifies a lull in the reports during the COVID-19 pandemic, likely due to Health Canada restrictions imposed on businesses in response. However, FinTrack did notice an increase in transactions involving online casinos in 2019 and 2020, and indicated that this is an upward trend in money laundering method for traffickers. Some potential suspicious activity may look like transactions at the casino that included cash purchases of casino chips, cash advances from player gaming accounts, and casino disbursements in cash or check. There also may be instances where one individual is transferring chips to other individuals and having them cash them out on their behalf. Another indicator are funds that are deposited to or withdrawn from a casino player's account with limited or no gambling involved, and the use of ATMs that are not owned by financial institutions. When it comes to players' gaming accounts, in the majority of cases, they took the balance of the cash removed from the account on the same day or within a matter of days. As it relates to online casinos, money laundering activity can look like frequent purchases and or payments to online gambling casino platforms, particular if these funds were sourced from incoming email money transfers from multiple individuals. These purchases tend to occur late in the evening and early morning hours. This next section is going to focus on gaming specific indicators. Um, But before we get into those red flags, it's important to note that a trafficker may be with their victim, they may be on the premises somewhere else, or they may send a victim onto the casino floor alone or into the adjacent resort property to meet or find clients. Like I mentioned, traffickers may also be using casino amenities to launder the proceeds of crime, like we discussed on the last slide, or even just to occupy their time while the victim is meeting clients. Some victims may be unfamiliar with the rules, the protocols, or the culture of the gaming environment. Another important note before we look at some of the key indicators is that there is no standard outfit of choice to identify a victim of trafficking. As contradictory as that might sound, a trafficking victim may not appear out of place, they may not appear inappropriately dressed, and they may not appear distressed. Alternatively, they may appear inappropriately dressed for the occasion, the environment, or the time of year. And again, a quick note before we begin, but thinking about each indicator alone is not necessarily going to indicate that someone is being trafficked. Again, we really want you to consider the situation, the context, and overall patterns of behavior. Some potentials indicators of trafficking in casinos can include a person who seeks permission from a third party for normal behaviors like ordering food, going to the washroom, and they might be not making their decisions independently. Perhaps they're being escorted. They aren't necessarily moving around freely or speaking freely. A person who is accompanied for or watched closely by a third party, they may remain in view and communicate via physical cues, or someone else might be speaking on their behalf. A person who provides scripted answers to casual questions, maybe they lie about their age, try to use a false ID, or they might leave the premises when they're asked for ID. They may refuse to cooperate. An individual might appear ill, uneasy in the company of others. They might appear uncomfortable or anxious, agitated, etc. They may express fear and intimidation through facial expressions or body language. The individual may display signs of anxiety, fatigue, fear, paranoia, submissiveness, tension around other people. They may have branding with the tattoos of the trafficker's name or symbol. It may be an individual who's making reoccurring or frequent trips to the gaming area and leaves with or is closely followed by different individuals. And an individual who may have lost a sense of time or unable to identify what region or city they are currently located in. Some other additional things to be on the lookout for. So, an individual who has a heightened awareness of other patrons in the gaming area, potentially big winners, or patrons who are intoxicated. If the individual is overly observant or express interest about casino security and surveillance, they may avoid eye contact. Again, may have someone else speak for them or taking physical cues from a third party. A young individual who is on site, so maybe in the hotel or restaurant, even though no age appropriate events are being hosted in the area. Victims of familial trafficking may be more likely to visit a family friendly casino and resort property where they're more likely to blend in. Casino employees may witness individuals being subjected to verbal, physical, or emotional abuse, bullying, or demeaning treatment. There also may be visible signs of abuse, so cuts, bruises, burns, etc. Traffickers may recruit out of casinos and then return back to their vehicle with a prospective new victim. An individual who attends a casino regularly with different people but does not appear to be family or friends and has little to no gaming activity as well. Some other potential casino based indicators may include an individual who does not have ID or whose ID is held by someone else. This person may also be asking casino staff or other patrons for food or money, again, with little or no gaming activity. An individual who accompanies different people to make cash withdrawals, and an individual who does not have their own money, their own gaming funds, or their funds are being controlled by a third party. Again, an individual who is attending the casino with little to no gameplay or gainful employment in the surrounding area. Some casino-based transportation indicators could include an individual who travels to the casino in the early morning and late evening with no hotel reservation, an individual who travels with another person who they might seem uneasy about, are controlled by, or who speaks on their behalf, an individual who frequents the same route but appear to carry on items, their person that they didn't have earlier in the day. Victims and traffickers might not sit together on the bus, but they may remain in view of one another and communicate via physical cues. Again, here we also may want to think about those general human trafficking indicators from part one of the training as well. It's really important to recognize that casinos and resorts are an ecosystem in and of themselves. When a business wants to think about making itself less appealing and less hospitable for criminal activity, it's important that we consider the entire ecosystem and all of its parts and look at holistic solutions. This means ensuring that bus drivers who operate the coach buses that bring patrons to the business are trained on how to spot trafficking, and that housekeeping and food and beverage staff are also part of building a wall of defense against this crime, too. While laundering of proceeds is something that might take place at a casino, if there is a resort attached, there is also the chance that exploitation could be occurring on the premises. Hotels can be a location for both sex and labor trafficking in Canada. Hotels are an attractive location for traffickers to conduct business because it gives them privacy, discretion, and a sense of safety due to the anonymity of being a hotel guest. When we talk about behavioral indicators of suspected trafficking activity in the hospitality sector, again, we can encourage you to consider a pattern of activity or behavior as well as the overall context. So some potential hospitality indicators may include staff who notice or receive reports of excessive noise, i.e. television noise coming from or music coming from a hotel room throughout the day and night. Staff may notice an excessive amount of alcohol, illicit drugs, and or sex paraphernalia in the room. Cleaning staff might see that there's an excessive number of phones, computers, or swipe machines in the room. There may be frequent requests for linens and towels. Alternatively, there may be a do not disturb sign that stays on the room for the duration on the door for the duration of the stay, and that the guests may actually bar housekeep staff from cleaning or entering the room. Again, this slide has indicators that, depending on the context, could be totally innocent, but layered with other behaviors and indicators that we've already discussed in this training could indicate that something is amiss. For example, frequent low value purchases at food and beverage areas, so like appetizers or add-ons instead of main courses, while on its own isn't strange, but perhaps coupled with someone who is being controlled and monitored or escorted might require some additional consideration from staff. Excessive traffic in and out of a room at unusual hours, someone who might be loitering in the hallway or appearing to monitor foot traffic in the hallway. An individual who does not use the resort amenities, so the gym, the pool, the spa. Again, I've traveled to many hotels without taking a dip in the pool, but when we layer it with other behaviors and patterns of behavior, that's when things might start to be off or amiss. If an individual is observed frequenting more than one hotel room, again, this could be totally innocent. It could be a group of reservations for a family reunion, and folks are visiting back and forth between the rooms. So by sharing these indicators, I hope it's becoming clear to you to understand how nuanced this is and how important context is. Some other potential indicators within the hospitality industry. So, an individual may walk around scoping out the security while looking for new clients. They may be spending most of their time in the bar, near hotel elevators, or corners of the property where there's a lot of foot traffic. They may be seen approaching patrons who they do not seem to share an existing relationship with and striking up conversations. Um, they may be seen arriving with a group, but they don't really associate with others in the group while they're working. Individuals have few or no personal items, such as no luggage or bags. Really quickly, I wanted to touch on a significant labor trafficking case from 2019 that occurred in Ontario. Migrant workers from Mexico were recruited by a family operated cleaning company that subcontracted with hotels and resorts throughout Ontario's cottage country. The workers were promised work and education opportunities in Canada, but ended up living in crowded, unsanitary conditions and were subjected to having illegal fees deducted from their pay so that they were often only earning less than $50 per week. In total, 43 men and women were horribly exploited by this family run trafficking operation. Sadly, the resorts and hoteliers had no idea that this was happening to the men and women working alongside them. I share this story because it's important to understand that the hospitality businesses can be at risk for both sex and labor trafficking activity. In 2023, it's no longer acceptable for a business to say that it didn't know. Businesses need to do their due diligence to understand the ethics associated with supply chain related compliance for both goods and labor. I also want to talk about the importance of implications for businesses who either turn a blind eye to trafficking or fail to ensure that their businesses and property have taken the necessary steps to implement safety protocols when there are suspected trafficking situations occurring. In the United States, particularly, there have been a number of high profile civil suits against hotels which have failed to intervene in trafficking situations, some of which involved minors. While we haven't seen this type of civil suit here in Canada quite yet, it's not outside the realm of possibility. We also know that there have been instances where staff have been reported to have acted as brokers, facilitating meetings between trafficked people and potential buyers. And this is where background screening of employees is really crucial, as well as clear internal reporting policies for staff. Human trafficking incidents can bring the business negative publicity, which carries reputational risk. And failing to address serious safety issues can negatively impact the morale of staff, can result in high turnover rates, and ultimately affect the profitability of the business. Part 6, Tools and Resources for the Gaming Sector. Trafficking is a complex crime. It is dynamic, and traffickers are ever evolving their tactics to stay one step ahead. And this is absolutely true with the introduction of certain technologies, which are helping to facilitate trafficking operations while allowing perpetrators to stay one step removed from the activity. This crime requires collaborative, cross-sectoral solutions. In Canada, governments and the social service sector have been working to address the unique needs of survivors and disrupt trafficking operations. And more recently, the private sector has joined the fight too. The next section will identify tools, resources, and practical actions to empower private sector actors to be part of the solution to addressing trafficking in Canada. So what is the private sector doing on the issue of trafficking? We know that there are committed private sector leaders in Canada and the US, as well as globally, who are meaningfully committing to addressing this issue. Here in Canada, Project Protect is a private-public partnership between the major banks in Canada and the Federal Financial Intelligence Transaction Reporting and Analysis Center, or FINTRAC, which used existing anti-money laundering and terrorist financing regulations to flag suspicious transactions related to trafficking and money laundering on bank accounts. This model has been successfully replicated in other jurisdictions and has spawned a number of Canada-specific projects focused on child sexual abuse material, as well as organ and fentanyl trafficking. Marriott International has implemented anti-human trafficking training that has seen over 1 million staff educated to spot the red flag indicators of human trafficking. WestJet has employee training and provides flight support and assistance to eligible human trafficking survivors and callers to the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline. Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking has developed the Survivor Inclusion Initiative that assists unbanked trafficking survivors access banking facilities in a trauma-informed way. And Truckers Against Trafficking has trained a number of high-profile trucking and shipping organizations like FedEx and Walmart, as well as Costco, and including trucking associations and trucking schools. To date, they have trained over 15,000 Canadian trucking, energy sector, and law enforcement personnel on the issue of trafficking. Noted survivor and best-selling author Tamaya Nagy so aptly put, trafficking happens in our communities and it requires a whole community response. Last but not least, I want to finish today's training by sharing a little bit more about the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, which is a critical resource for communities, and then finally by giving you some concrete takeaway action steps. The hotline is a trauma-informed, person-centered service that provides referrals, information, and resources to victims and survivors of trafficking, but as well as to the broader community. Members of the public are encouraged to call and discuss potential reporting situations and discuss their reporting options. Cases and tips reported by the public are triaged and may be referred onto law enforcement points of contact if requested and if appropriate. The hotline is available 24/7, 365 days a year in both French and English, with live interpretation available upon request. The hotline is currently accessible by our 1-800 number by phone. We have a chat function on our website. You can email us and send a web form. And the hotline has partnerships with over 950 social service providers across Canada, which works out to approximately 3,700 unique service offerings, and has developed referral and reporting relationships with over 100 law enforcement agencies. The hotline serves all provinces and territories in Canada, and really it's available for anyone in need of assistance, information, training, or resources related to the issue of trafficking. The hotline is a great resource that employees and community members who might require more information, have questions, or just need resources. Callers can remain completely anonymous and can confidentially discuss potential trafficking situations, evaluate the indicators or the behavior that they've witnessed with a trained professional. We know that trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum, and this is really a important resource for our communities. I mentioned some of this earlier, but the hotline can provide the following services. So again, safety planning for individuals who are being trafficked or who know someone who is, and really provide you with practical steps to stay safe. It can provide a direct connection to social services in your community or closest community. It can provide trauma-informed, non-judgmental, and non-prescriptive support. It can provide you with general information. And finally, callers again are able to discuss potential trafficking situations and what their reporting options might be. Your workplace will likely have specific actions, policies, and protocols that staff should adhere to when encountering a suspected trafficking incident or suspected money laundering associated with trafficking activity. The hotline again is a great resource for employees and community members who have questions or need resources. The anonymity of the hotline allows them to evaluate those indicators with a professional. Um, but ultimately, I want to leave you with the final words is that we really recommend that you do not confront individuals or directly voice concerns or suspicions, even if it's coming from a place of genuine concern. We know that this can endanger not only yourself, but the person who's being exploited. It's important to remember that not all exploited persons want help getting out of their current situation. There are so many factors at play that may prevent a survivor of trafficking from seeking help, and pushing this before they are actually ready to do so will not only be ineffective, but it might be harmful and may increase the level of violence that they are experiencing. As I mentioned earlier, having posters and information available to staff and guests is key to combating this crime and helping trafficked persons access help when they are ready. The hotline has free resources available for download that have been translated into 11 additional languages as well as 18 Indigenous languages. Please visit our website at www.canadianhumantraffickinghotline.ca to download yours today. And finally, here are some concrete steps that professionals and businesses can take to become better allies in the fight against human trafficking. 1. Empower employees by implementing yearly mandatory training for all staff, including frontline, maintenance, housing, food and beverage, security, and upper management, as well as anti-trafficking policies. There are experts in your community committed to prevention. Support their work and their efforts by seeking them out to host an employee training. Hotels are also encouraged to sign the ECPAT code, which is a voluntary set of business principles that travel and hospitality companies can implement to prevent sexual exploitation and trafficking of children in their properties. The code provides awareness tools and support to the travel and hospitality industry. Again, post the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline number in staff break areas, notice boards, in hotel rooms, and on digital screens that are accessible to the public. Support anti-trafficking organizations. Some suggestions may be including selecting an anti-trafficking charity for a corporate donation or employer matching program, or contributing dignity items to a local organization that supports trafficked persons, in-kind donations of conference space, or even emergency shelter in available hotel rooms for survivors when shelters are full. Hire survivor consultants to review policies and audit trainings to ensure that they are survivor informed, and consider creating specialized opportunities for survivors to re-enter the mainstream job market. Ensure there are clear anti-trafficking policies in place for suppliers of both goods and labor. Ensure that you are enforcing those policies. And finally, last but not least, please share what you have learned today. Take this information back to your dinner table, to your community, and your places of worship. Awareness is one of the critical ways that we can help to shine a light on the issue of trafficking. For more information about the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking, to access research reports or make a donation to support our work, please visit www.canadiancentretoendhumantrafficking.ca. If you have questions or are looking to coordinate services for yourself or on behalf of a survivor of trafficking, please call the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-833-900-1010.